that's a wonderful introduction. And I feel I have the privilege this evening of introducing another gentleman, Iain Dale, who I think has written a very important book. We know him from Iain Dale in the Evening on LBC. We know him from his podcasts. We know him from his writings. But in this book, Why Can't We All Just Get Along? Shout less, listen more. He's taken us somewhere further along a line of discussing something very important in these fraught political days, moderation, listening, being kind, if that doesn't sound to be a cliche. So without more ado, can we welcome Iain to this event? As Carl said, there will be a chance for you to ask questions at the end. I'm just going to start straight off, Iain, with my first question. What happened? What was happening to make you want to write this book?
Well, first of all, James, thanks to Leeds Literary Festival for inviting me. I was supposed to come in person last summer, but we all know what happened then. And it's great that this festival is going ahead, albeit in digital form. Maybe I can come back next year in physical form and talk about my next book, The Prime Minister's. Who knows? What made me write this book? Well, I suppose throughout my career, I've been involved in communication to one degree or another, involved in the political world, the media world. And I think things have changed an awful lot. It isn't just over the last few years that our sense of public discourse has deteriorated. It has been going on for quite a long time. You could argue, if you wanted, well, it's always been thus. If you look at the cartoons of the 18th and 19th centuries, and you look at the debates in the House of Commons, they were far more rumbustious than they are nowadays. And people weren't afraid to have their say in a very certain way. Well, I think the worst of those eras has come back, and it is courtesy of the internet. And the internet is a double-edged sword here, because in many ways it's been fantastic in educational terms. It's been fantastic enabling people to take part in debates and democracy in a way that they never could before. But it's also enabled some very bad people to have a platform. And I think that has contributed to it a lot. And so it was in the I think the end of 2018 when the Queen in her Christmas message basically said, why can't we all just get along? Let's shout, let's listen more. Now, she didn't actually use those exact words, but that was the message. And the Mail on Sunday rang me up, I think on Boxing Day, and said, look, this has resonated. We've seen that you've been talking about this a little bit as well. Would you like to write a 1,500-word article for us? Well, frankly, the last thing I wanted to do at Christmas was to write a 1,500-word article, but you kind of don't turn down a national newspaper when they offer you a platform like that. So I wrote this article and it got a huge response. Now, that didn't make me think, oh, I must write a book about this. But my literary agent, very grand that I have a literary agent, isn't it? We'd been trying to think of a book to write for a long time, but there was nothing that really caught my imagination. And I thought, I want to write a book that I really want to write rather than one that I think I just could write. And HarperCollins had rung him and said, look, we'd like Iain Dale to write a book for us, which was nice. So I went along to see them, and I had a slightly different idea for a book. I don't know how many people who are watching have heard of Emily Maitlis's book, Airhead, which is an interestingly titled book. I thought a very strangely titled book for a blonde presenter, but it's a brilliant book it's 40 chapters about different episodes in her broadcasting career. And as I was reading it, I thought, I could write a book like this. And I started writing down chapter headings because it was all about her experiences in the media, events that she'd been broadcasting at, people that she'd interviewed, the art of the political interview, all of that sort of thing. So I came up with 40 chapter headings, and I thought, well, job done. I can write 2,000 or 3,000 words on each of these. So that was my idea for the book. Well, the HarperCollins commissioning editor, Ed Faulkner, he had read my article in the Mail on Sunday and other things that I'd written about the subject. And he said, well, this is the book that I want you to do. And I thought, well, I think we could combine the two here, because a lot of people who will buy the book will have heard of me through LBC, through my broadcasting and various TV things. So we've sort of combined the two. And I did wonder when I'd finished it whether it was a bit of an awkward mix in some ways, but as you'll know, James, it's very anecdotal. I try to use experiences from my broadcasting career and time in politics to illustrate the points I'm making about public discourse. So that was how it came about.
Yeah, at the very beginning of the book, somewhere you right, it was written from experience and from the heart. And that came through so strongly. I mean, you're quite self-revelatory in this, kind of show quite a lot of yourself. Was that awkward? Are you inclined to do that in life anyway?
I'm pretty much an open book. I mean, obviously, look, we all have things that we would rather not disclose, that we'd rather not talk about. You don't get to the age of 58 without having done things in your life which maybe you look back on and think, that was not the best thing to have done. And I do talk about quite a lot of those things in the book, as you've seen. When I first joined LBC, my boss then said to me, because I wasn't a trained broadcaster, I wasn't a trained journalist, I've sort of learned it as I've gone along. But he said, look, if you're doing phone-ins, and that's essentially what LBC is, a phone-in station, that the listener wants to connect with you. And the best way to connect with the listener is to be as open about yourself as possible. So don't be afraid to introduce your own experiences. You're not here as a BBC presenter to say, well, on the one hand this and on the other hand that. You're allowed to have an opinion. And if you're talking about a subject that you've got experience of, bring it into the conversation. And that can be quite easy to do. It can be quite difficult to do on occasion. It can be a very emotional roller coaster. I mean, my partner sometimes says to me when I get home, can you keep nothing private? And there are some very private things in this book. I mean, I talk about the time that I was nearly raped, which I had talked about on CNN once. I didn't intend to, but Bonnie Greer, who I was on with, was talking about a date rape that she had undergone. And I just found myself sort of blurting all of this out. So I wrote about that. And I mean, when the book came out, the Observer rang me up and they said, well, we're doing a review of, I can't remember what the program was called, The Stranger or something like that. And it involves a male rape, and we'd like to sort of talk to you about it. When I saw the article, it didn't even mention this television program. It was all about what had happened to me, which I was slightly taken aback by. But then I thought, well, in for a penny, in for a pound. So the next night on LBC, I did a 2-hour phone-in on male rape and asked men who either had been raped or had been victims of sexual assault to ring in. Now, if you think about it, that's my producers were very anxious about that because they thought, well, is anybody really going to ring in and talk about that? And I said, trust me, they will. And within 5 minutes, we had a full switchboard of calls, and we had the most, I mean, it was a brilliant 2 hours in many ways. It was an uncomfortable 2 hours for some people, probably. It was challenging radio, but what's the point of just talking about immigration and benefits all the time? You need to challenge your audience sometimes. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to write a book like this, I've got to be honest. We're talking about the way people talk to each other. And I mean, I admit in the book that in the past, I've been as guilty as anyone, particularly on Twitter, which I think is an evil medium in many ways. It's a brilliant medium in others. But I am a human being. If somebody insults me on Twitter, my natural instinct is to insult them back, and probably more so. And I did too much of that. And that was part of the reason for writing the book, that in the end, I thought, this is ridiculous. You can't go around calling people twats. So the most I do now is call someone a muppet, which in some ways is slightly more wounding, I suppose, but it's kinder.
Yeah.
And I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, when he became leader of the Labour Party, said we want kinder, gentler politics. Not quite sure he achieved that. But the sentiment was right. And so if I feel the sap rising now, I do take a pause. I don't immediately type a response. And if you do take a pause, you inevitably calm down a little bit. And sometimes you can rescue things that could go very badly wrong. I had a few weeks ago, a guy called Richard tweeted, Iain Dale is so far up Boris Johnson's arse, you can't see his shoes. And I thought, well, I know that over the last few weeks, I've been really critical of Boris Johnson and his government. So instead of sending a fairly incendiary tweet back, I just said, this is wrong. Here are 9 occasions when I've criticised Boris Johnson and his government. The next day, he direct messaged me to say, look, I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have said that. I realised that I was wrong. And since then, we've developed we've never met, but we actually talk on WhatsApp most days. It's a sort of slightly weird friendship that has built out of what could have been a situation where we would have been sworn enemies for life, and I would have just pressed the block button. So you can get along sometimes with people who instinctively are anti you because they don't share your politics, or they just think that you're something that you're not.
I think what you've just said is that you're sort of embodying some of the kind of philosophy and ideas in the book, which is actually shouting less and listening more, and possibly thinking before you respond, because too many people on Twitter seem to be on Twitter with loaded guns that they're prepared to fire. I mean, you say Twitter paved the way for far higher levels of abuse and vituperation. Clearly, that's the case, isn't it?
Well, it is. And look, I'm not. I think all forms of social media are dangerous in some ways. But if we go back to the 1990s, when the internet was in its infancy, and if you were Mrs. Miggins from 32 Acacia Avenue, Scunthorpe, your only way of making yourself heard was to write a letter to your local newspaper, which might be published once in a blue moon. Well, then the internet came along and people could build their own websites or get somebody to build them for them. You couldn't really change them without having somebody who knew about coding do it, but there was an opportunity for a bit of a platform. Then blogs came along in about 2002, and I was one of the first movers on political blogs, and that's kind of, I had done media stuff before, but that's kind of what got me into political commentary. And blogs were a much more instantaneous form of a website. You could upload your own articles within minutes, and then people would comment on them, and you would enter into a debate. And initially it was all very nice, but then it started to descend into the gutter, and people would register anonymously. And we still see that today on the Daily Mail website, for example. If you look at the comments section of that, you look at YouTube videos, and I mean, it has to be seen to be believed. So then came Twitter, and this was about 2007 when Twitter launched. And I couldn't really see the point of Twitter to start. I registered my name so nobody else could use it. But I thought, why does anyone want to know what I had for breakfast? So I didn't really engage in Twitter until I worked out what I wanted out of it and how it could help me. It sounds terribly pretentious, but sort of market my brand and market the work that I do, whether it's in broadcasting or books or newspaper articles or whatever. And I got followers quite quickly, but the more followers you get, the more open you are to the trolls. And of course, on Twitter, it's sort of blogging 100 times quicker, because you literally see something, you instantly type a response, press send, and there it is. And a lot of people have come unstuck, particularly well-known people, particularly politicians who may have had a bad day. They react to a constituent in a slightly rude way, and then it's on the front page of their local paper. So, and it's just given people who have bad motives a platform which could be avoided. I mean, if Twitter decided to make sure that they verified everybody who used the platform, it would be a much quieter, much nicer place. Now, you could argue, well, it'd be a very boring place as well. But sometimes it doesn't matter if it's boring.
It struck me early on in this book when you're talking about the importance of debate and regular TV debates, and you said somewhere that heat has become more important than light. What do you mean by that? Heat has become more important than light.
Well, everything is black and white now. There's no sense of nuance at all. You can't be 70% in favor of something. You have to be 100% in favor of something. And if you aren't, you are regarded as some sort of moderate renegade who is just a bit wishy-washy. We see that with, I mean, you look at what's happened in America over the last few years with Donald Trump. You're either for me or you're against me. And you can't say, well, actually, I mean, if I ever say, well, to give Donald Trump his credit, ... because I mean, there are things that Donald Trump did which are good, but I mean, you can't say that nowadays. You're drummed out of the brownies if you say that. If you say that, oh, well, Jeremy Corbyn wasn't all bad. Well, if you are sort of on the centre right, people look at you and think, what? I mean, maybe that's a bad example, but I just And nuance is a word that crops up time and time again in the book. And I think in all sorts of political debates now, we all know that in Parliament, if you want to run a campaign, you have to build a coalition of support, whether within your own party and outside your own party. And you get things done in that way. When Lynn Featherstone decided as a junior Liberal Democrat minister in the coalition government that her only aim as a minister was to get gay marriage through Parliament when she was a junior Home Office minister, she didn't think, oh, well, I'm not going to talk to the evil Tories or I'm not going to talk to Labour. She got people together to build up a sense of momentum to what she wanted to do. And as somebody who's worked in lobbying before, that's what you want to do. You want to win hearts and minds. Well, you don't win hearts and minds by just ignoring a big section of society. And when the former Labour MP Laura Pidcock said in an interview that she could never be friends with a Conservative, I thought, you don't really get Parliament, do you? Because cross-party cooperation is absolutely intrinsic to being a success in Parliament. And just from a human point of view, I mean, I'd like to think that everybody who's watching this today has friends from all over the political spectrum. I'd like to think that if you voted Remain in the referendum, that you wouldn't immediately defriend someone just because they supported Brexit. And in a way, the whole Brexit debate, sorry to mention that word because we've kind of got it out of our political debate a little bit at the moment, but that debate summed up everything that is wrong with our modern day political discourse, where members of a family would fall out, friendships would shatter over it. Well, and this really goes back to the root of the whole book. If you can't accept that somebody else has a right to a point of view, you're on a very slippery slope. And if you don't want to listen to that point of view and just only want to listen to people in your own echo chamber, how can you possibly marshal an argument for a debate without understanding the arguments that the other side are putting forward? Because, you know, just occasionally they might be right. And just occasionally you might think, well, they do have a point on that. What's my argument against that? And that's what I've tried to sort of rail against, to encourage people not to just read newspapers that they tend to agree with, or watch TV news programs where they agree with the presenters. I mean, I get often people say to me, oh, I really like your program, Iain, but I can't listen to that James O'Brien. Well, I'm thinking, you may not agree with him, but listen to him, so at least you can debate him if you ever get the chance to debate him. I prefer on my radio, I don't want to do a phone in where every single caller is going to ring in and say, yes, Iain, you're absolutely right. I mean, how boring is that? It might do my ego a lot of good, but as a radio listen, it's awful. I'd much rather people phone in and challenge me. And I know now that after doing this for 10 years, where I speak about issues every night that I am certainly not always an expert on, sometimes I know nothing about them whatsoever, but I've learned so much that when I go on any questions or question time now, I'm no longer nervous that I'm going to dry up, because I know that I can say something about any subject and sound relatively lucid. That does depend on the subject a little bit, but and I don't have to have a whole host of cue cards that I would prepare just in case a question came up. And that's because I listen to the other point of view. And I have had my mind changed during the course of an hour's debate.
I was going to ask that because I wondered whether perhaps doing this as you've done for many, many years, you've actually moved a bit more to the center of things because you can understand both sides a little bit more. You've heard so many opinions, so many people have rung in. There's a bit in the book where you talk about people ringing in with their problems with benefits and things, and homelessness, and you've actually sort of moved a little bit in your opinions. That's a very healthy thing, isn't it?
Well, if Twitter is to be believed, I've become very lefty and woke. I don't think I've changed that much. You are right. I cite some examples in the book where we were talking about universal credit one evening, and towards the end of the hour, I had 3 middle-aged men phone in. Each of them broke down in tears on the radio.
Yes.
Now, I don't think they intended to do that when they came on the radio. They would have probably been quite embarrassed that they'd done it. But when you have 3 adults do that one after another, you kind of think something is going wrong here. Whatever the theory of the policy, something is going wrong in the implementation of it. Now, that it's very difficult to say, well, it is either X person to blame, I mean, ex cabinet minister to blame, or the civil service or whoever. But you just have to accept that something is going wrong. It's like the bedroom tax. I could make a perfectly logical, theoretical defense of the bedroom tax, but again, it didn't work in practice because, well, for the reasons that we all know. So I'm very lucky in that when I hear these things from my listeners, I can pick up the phone to a cabinet minister and say, look, I don't know if you're aware of this, but this is happening. I had that happen the other day with somebody who was about to reach pension age, but because of COVID, her pension wasn't going to be paid on time. And because she was reaching pensionable age, the universal credit would stop on her birthday. So she was facing several months possibly of having no income whatsoever. And I think, that is a real issue, because if it's happened to her, presumably there are lots of other people that it's happened to. So I texted Therese Coffey, the Work and Pensions Secretary, and said, look, just so you know, you may be aware of this, in which case, sorry for bothering you, but this has happened to someone I know. You might want to sort of check this, because I can see this being on the front page of the Daily Mirror a few weeks down the line. And she came back and she said, well, that shouldn't be happening. And it was sorted for this particular individual, but she said, I've actually asked my permanent secretary to launch an inquiry into this to see if it is a widespread problem and then we need to deal with. And I thought, well, good on you. That's what should happen. But on the other hand, not everybody who's got a problem is going to have someone like me who can text the cabinet minister and get it sorted. But all I can do is what I can do.
I mean, I'm impressed with that story, but it also, you mentioned in the book having something that you refer to as imposter syndrome. So on one hand, you have the ability to text a cabinet minister, which is very cool indeed. I mean, I can think of things I'd like to text.
Yeah, I'm sure you can. Oh, and believe me, sometimes I do.
Good for you. On the other hand, you have that thing, which I used to have. I was deputy head of a high school, and I would trot around the school thinking, everybody thinks I'm 37, but actually I feel 7. I'm wondering whether this is what you're talking about when you refer to imposter syndrome, the fact that you seem to be at the center of things, but there's a little boy in there saying, I can't quite believe this. Is that it?
That is mainly it. You're absolutely right. I mean, look, my mother always loved it when someone said, oh, he's so well spoken, isn't he? And because a lot of people think I went to private school,
Sure.
I mean, I don't think I've got a particularly posh accent, but some people seem to think I have. I went to a comprehensive in Essex. I didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. I went to the University of East Anglia, which I'm now a visiting professor at, believe it or not. And so I can remember the first day that I worked in Parliament it would have been in 1985, when I was a very junior researcher, effectively glorified secretary. And I was walking from the central lobby of the House of Commons to the House of Lords for some reason. And there, in front of me, walking towards me, were former Prime Minister James Callaghan and former President Gerald Ford.
Wow.
And I remember to this day exactly what went through my mind at that point. What's a boy from Essex doing in a place like this?
Sure. And
that sense of slight wonderment has never quite left me. And I always wanted to be involved in politics. I wanted to be an MP. I always wanted to be involved in the media. I mean, I did want to be a radio presenter. So I've achieved 50% of that. But there's always been this thing that and this has really only left me in recent years, and I think it wasn't probably until I was over 50 that this really left me. If I was in a group of people, so I was with David Cameron, George Osborne, Nick Bowles, Ed Vaizey, just in a group having a chat, I would always be the one that would be slightly holding back, because they'd all been to Oxbridge, they'd all been to public school. David obviously went to Eton, and I hesitate to say I felt inferior, but I suppose that's the best word to use. And it was only really in recent years that that feeling has gone. So in a social sense, it's gone. But I've still got it about my writing. Whenever I write an article for a newspaper, when I press send, I always imagine it's going to come back and somebody will say, this is rubbish, start again. When I started the book, that was, I mean, when I sent off the final manuscript, I was convinced that they were going to come back and say, I'm sorry, this just isn't up to par. I'm afraid we can't go ahead with it. Now, they didn't. Some people might think they should have done, but that is still there in my writing, because I can't write like Michael Gove or Boris Johnson or Danny Finkelstein. I just can't. I tend to write as I speak. Now, there is a certain strength in that, and I think I hope that comes through in the book. But I haven't got the sort of intellectual writing style that regular national newspaper columnists have. I mean, I had a column on the Telegraph for 2 years, and I always thought they would send a column back. They never did. So I must have been doing something right. But I'm totally confident in what I do on the radio now. I wasn't in the early years, but I am now. I know I can do it, and I know that I can be good at it. But on my writing, no. Which is not really a good way to advertise my book, is it, frankly?
I don't know. I mean, I think every writer who sends something off to their publisher sits in a darkened room with their fingers in their ears, waiting for a response, because they've seen it on the screen and they look at it and think, this is all a bit rubbish, isn't it?
Well, I didn't get a response for 3 weeks, so I was convinced that I was going to get some really bad news. But when they did come, because I was supposed to write 70,000 words and I wrote 122,000 words, so we had to really cut it back. But no, I mean, they were very pleased. So thank God.
You said at the very beginning that you'd come up with something like 40 chapter headings or something like that. Did this pretty much make the substance of the book as it subsequently turned out, or did you cut it down? Because I had the feeling there were half a dozen topics you were hitting in this book. Half a dozen.
Well, I think there are 19 chapters in the book, so I did cut it down and I combined a few.
Yes.
I mean, essentially the book is in 3 parts. Part 1 is sort of media, then politics, and then issues. And I mean, that's why I thought maybe it was sort of a slightly awkward structure in the end. It's not just one long narrative, but it is a book I think you can dip into rather than necessarily read from cover to cover. But I mean, it's not a long book. I mean, it doesn't take, and it's not, I mean, you're not going to be challenged by the writing. You might be challenged in some of your views. And I mean, nobody's going to read this book and get to the end of it and think, well, I agree with every single word he said. They might agree with some of the themes and the conclusions I come to. But the great thing is that I've had people who have totally the opposite politics to me saying, well done, a lot of that needed to be said. I don't agree with what you said on crime, and I don't agree with what you said on this or that or the other, but what you've said about public discourse, buy into that completely.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. I mean, a slightly naughty question here, if you don't mind. Margaret Thatcher was an inspiration for you. Why and how?
I grew up, I was, when she was elected leader of the Conservative Party, I was 12 years old. Right. Was I? 12? Yes, I think I was. And I remember the day that she was elected leader, February the 11th, 1975, I ran upstairs to tell my grandmother, who was ill in bed, that she had been elected leader of the Conservative Party. My grandmother burst into tears. And I thought, that's a bit odd. Anyway, later she explained that it was because she never thought she would live to see a woman lead a political party, let alone then become prime minister. And I started out as a liberal. We did a school project at the end of our O-levels in 1978 on local politics, and I had to go and interview the Liberal mayor of Saffron Walden, where I grew up. And I joined the local Liberal Party for a few months. And then it must have been Margaret Thatcher's 1978 conference speech that really made me switch. And if you remember, those of you who are old enough back to those days, I mean, inflation was rampant, unemployment was going up, the country was bedeviled by strikes. And I can just remember, even as a 12, 13, 14-year-old, thinking, there must be a better way than this. This is, and Britain was seen as the sick man of Europe. I remember going on a school exchange to Germany, and they would literally openly laugh at us because of our strikes. And so I heard this speech and I thought, well, I agree with every word of that. I thought she diagnosed the problems, and not just diagnosed the problems, but had come up with solutions. So when she became prime minister, I became a bit of a fan. And when I went to university in Norwich, very left-wing university, there was no conservative organisation there. And in the spring of my first year, the Falklands War happened. And I went along to a debate on the Falklands War thinking it would be someone putting the government's point of view versus somebody who wasn't. But it wasn't. It was the hard left versus the soft left. And they agreed that Margaret Thatcher was evil. And I began to get, the sap was rising, and I thought, I'm going to have my say here. So I got up and had my say and really enjoyed doing it. I mean, I had sort of made a few little speeches in the sixth form, but that was really my first sort of public outing, I suppose. So a friend of mine and I put up a stand at the Freshers' Fair in the second year, and we got more members for the Conservative Party than the Labour Club had, which in a left-wing university was quite something. So we invited cabinet ministers up to speak. I got invited to Downing Street as she had a reception for all of the different students. I remember walking up the famous stairway with all the pictures of the prime ministers, and there she was at the top. And I was thinking, oh my God, isn't she small? Because she was actually 5'4". I thought she was, the Iron Lady would be this imposing figure, but she was not. And so she guided you into the room with, as she shook your hand, it sort of moved into the room. And again, that was really, I suppose, the first time I thought, wow, I'm in 10 Downing Street. And I mean, I've been there many, many times since, but it still never leaves you, that feeling of walking up to the famous black door. And I thought that she got some things wrong, absolutely, but I thought generally she put the country back on its feet, and I thought she was a great prime minister, and we haven't seen anyone of that ilk since, and I doubt I will in the rest of my life.
Yeah, thank you, brilliant.
I do realise though that not everyone watching will share my view on that.
I'm wondering whether you might read something from the book at this point, Iain. Would that be possible?
Well, I'm going to read something which is not, well, it kind of is about public discourse in a way, but on my radio show, we talk about a lot of emotional issues, particularly mental health. And I've, particularly over the coronavirus pandemic, I've had some really emotional calls from people. And what I've discovered over the years is I've never suffered from depression or any form of mental illness, or not that I've recognized anyway, but I find the subject absolutely fascinating. And I love talking to people about their own situations. And I always think the more people talk about that, the more it helps other people. And even 10 or 15 years ago, you wouldn't find no one in the public eye talking about mental health, but it's become, I won't say it's become a fashion now, but people are quite happy to do it generally. So I'm going to read a section which will be self-explanatory. Iain, you're my number 10, said the voice on the phone late one Saturday night in December 2018. At around 1:45, my phone rang. It was someone who I knew from the world of politics, but not well. We'd texted a few times, but met only once. Initially, I assumed it was a pocket call, but I knew from Twitter that this person had had a few personal problems of late, so I took it. As I answered, I knew something was very wrong. Michael is not his name, but for the purposes of what I'm about to tell you, that's what I'm going to call him. I'm so sorry to have rung you, but I didn't know who else to ring. I'm in a bad way, and I've got 40 pills in front of me, and I want to kill myself. Those were his opening words, so far as I can recall. He explained that he was often having suicidal thoughts following a traumatic personal experience a few months ago. He had tried to get treatment on the NHS, but was told there was a lengthy waiting list. He'd been to see an NHS crisis team and told them of his state of mind. Their advice was to compile a list of 10 people he could call if he ever felt suicidal again. The second thing he said to me was that I was number 10 on his list, and he kept apologising for the fact. Eventually, it transpired that the other 9 people hadn't picked up. I talked to him for around 45 minutes, with the rather obvious aim of talking him down from what he was intending to do. Though I had very little experience of this, I knew that one wrong word could have some very tragic consequences. I won't go into all the details of the conversation, but during it, Michael told me that he was referred to NHS mental health services. That when he was referred to NHS mental health services, he was told there would be a 2-year wait for treatment. Even when he phoned the Samaritans, he was told there would be a 30-minute wait to talk to anyone. I can't remember all that I said. I do remember asking him to think about the effect on his friends and family if he did go through with it, and how upset they would be. The most important thing to try to persuade him of, I felt, was that there was something to live for, that he meant something to a lot of people, that it wouldn't always be like this. But as I've already said, listening to him explain why he felt the way he did was probably more important. I needed to convince Michael of the consequences of his intended action, and I think it registered. By the end of the conversation, it had become more normal, and I was relieved when I heard Michael laugh. It was quite clear that Michael and many others like him are being let down by the NHS. It is simply not acceptable for someone who has suicidal tendencies to be told they will have to wait months or even years for proper treatment. The Spectator journalist Isabel Hardman explained how she had a similar experience and had to spend her life savings going private. But what about those who don't have any savings to fund such treatments? I often argue that the NHS fails some patients because of structures rather than a lack of funding. But it is clear that in the field of mental health, funding is indeed the main issue, and it is one that must be addressed. Since that initial conversation, I've had at least 6 other similar calls from Michael. I suspect I've moved up his list from number 10. On occasion, I noticed people talking about him on Twitter. Somehow, I and others managed to find his address, and the police went round just in the nick of time. He called me the next day from hospital. At the time of writing, Michael is in a good place. New job, new home, a fresh start in life, able to put some of his more painful memories behind him. There is little doubt in my mind that the state of public discourse on social media is partly to blame for the rise in suicides among young people and the recent explosion of self-harming. I do not pretend to understand what motivates a 13-year-old to cut themselves. It's easy to put it down to a cry for help, but surely it goes deeper than that. Bullying used to be a physical phenomenon, but in the last 10 or 15 years, it's become a mental issue. Most bullying is not done face-to-face, it's done in text conversations or anonymously on the internet. The 11-year-old daughter of a friend of mine was bullied remorselessly on social media by an anonymous troll, but no one could have foreseen the identity of the bully. It was her best friend.
Interesting, thank you. And it's always a complete privilege to hear the writer reading their own works, because when I return to this book, and I will indeed return to it, I'll be able to hear your voice in my head, Iain. So,
do you know, that is the biggest compliment that I've been paid by people, particularly people who do listen to my radio show. They say they can hear my voice in every word, and so I'm getting a bit emotional.
no,
that really meant something to me.
I mean, it's when I read the book, I felt that I knew you by the end of the book, and people kept saying to me, "Oh, what's he like? What's he like?" And I said, "I think he's a really good guy," because it comes over, and you do write as you speak, which is not a put down. It's absolutely, it makes it a very warm and easy book, difficult at times to read. Now, I was interested that COVID actually prevented the publication of the book. But in your introduction to the introduction, you kind of indicated that hadn't entirely been a bad thing.
I think the publishers would certainly say it was a bad thing. And from a sales point of view, I don't know how many copies it's sold so far, but I mean, if bookshops are shut, I mean, okay, people buy from Amazon and everything else, but I've sold about 1,500 copies, signed copies myself. I set up a little online shop, which I've now developed into a proper political bookshop, politicos.co.uk, if you want to have a look at it. And I don't know how many have, I mean, it did relatively well on Amazon when it first came out. The paperback's coming out at the end of April, but again, I mean, we thought by the end of April, everything would be okay. But I mean, I had 40 literary festivals that I was going to speak at. And I mean, I don't know how many people, what proportion of people who go to a literary festival end up buying the book. But clearly that would have been a lot of sales. I was going to do lots of think tanks in London. Again, those are sales loss. So it's been incredibly frustrating this is the second book that I've written as a narrative book. I've edited a lot of books, but this is really the first normal big book I've done. And it was very, very galling for it to be affected like that. But I mean, there's no point in losing sleep over it because there's nothing I could have done about it. We could have just delayed the book until next year, I suppose. But I mean, it's already, you write about political events and you wait 2 years and it's all a bit sort of yesterday, isn't it? So there we are.
Except I think this book is remarkably prescient in the age of COVID and coronavirus. It seems to be a book that actually takes on some of the debates and some of the sheer nastiness and
Well,
side.
well, it does, and I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about is the whole role of the media in public debate, and I think politicians and journalists are sort of almost equally to blame when it does descend. And I mean, I don't know how many of you were watching Good Morning Britain at 7:15 this morning, but it was a sort of classic example where I do that every Friday morning with Jackie Smith, my partner from the For the Many podcast. And we go on to talk about the front pages of the newspapers, basically, with Ben Shepherd and Kate Garraway. And we have a bit of a laugh, and the Good Morning Britain audience quite like us because Jackie and I get on really well. She's Labour, I'm not, but we just like each other and we have good political banter. Today they put the Shadow Health Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth, on with us, who I really like and I've always got on well with. And he was saying what a disgrace it was that the nurses are only going to get a 1% pay rise. And I mean, everyone can have a view on that. I think politically it was a stupid thing to do. If they'd said 2%, at least it would have been above inflation and it would have cost another 500 million. But anyway, Ben and Kate quizzed him a little bit, but I didn't think they were asking the right questions. So when it came to, when they asked me what I thought, I said, well, just before I come on to what I think, can I put a question to Jonathan? And I said, Jonathan, you criticise the government for only offering 1%. What would you be offering? Thinking that he would have an answer to that, but he didn't. He just said, we would accept whatever the pay review body say. And I said, well, that's kind of what the government policy is. They've submitted their recommendation to the pay review body. You could do that as well, but all you're doing is slagging them off. We want to know, as an alternative government, what would you do? If it's not 1%, is it 2%? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? We would accept the pay review body. And I could almost hear the audience screaming at home because they're fed up with politicians that won't answer a question. And it wasn't a difficult question, and he should have foreseen it.
I mean, you talk about certain politicians who have got a whole kind of facade which enables them to evade answering the question. Is this part of the problem why I find myself yelling at the radio or the TV when a politician has been asked a perfectly reasonable question in terms of their brief and their responsibilities, but spend the next 10 minutes coming up with a kind of form of words to kind of hold the interviewer away from them?
It would very rarely be for the next 10 minutes because most political interviews nowadays are 3, 4, 5 minutes long, particularly if it's on a breakfast show or a drive time show. So what you have there is an imperfect storm. You have the politician knowing that they've only got a few minutes. So their spin doctors will say, well, Minister, in this interview, these are the 2 points that you need to make. So whatever I as the inquisitor ask, they will say what they want to say. From the journalist's point of view, the broadcaster's point of view, you have an editor in their ivory tower sort of wanting you to get a newsline out of this interview so it can be put on social media, you can get lots of hits on the website, etc., etc. So what you then find is, and I exaggerate to make a point here, but you find a really aggressive way of opening an interview. Minister, you're a disgrace, aren't you? Why aren't you ashamed of yourself? Aren't you going to resign, Minister? Well, believe it or not, politicians are human beings too. And if they come under attack like that, their shutters go up. And all they do then is trot out the party line and the sound bites. And so the poor bloody listener at home is let down by the journalist asking the question and the politician providing a non-answer. And we've seen this in perfect form. And I think the general public have really got fed up with this over COVID. Because if you look at the press conferences, the good questions are often asked by the regional journalists at the end. The terrible questions are asked by the household name journalists at the beginning, because all they want is a gotcha question and some sort of controversial answer so they can get it on their news programs and make themselves look good. And I am fed up with that kind of questioning, and I think the general public are too.
Brilliant. One last question before we open it up. In fact, I think we should probably go straight to questions from our audience because they're kind of lining up. But I've already noticed that one of our audience has already downloaded your book.
Fantastic.
People have appreciated your reading. And
there is an audio book as well.
Ah, there we go. So I'm wondering, if anybody out there has got a question, okay, let's just see. Iain, this is from somebody called James, but it is not me. Would you advocate a greater degree of cross-party politics at Westminster?
Well, I've already said that I think if you want anything done, it's quite a good thing to get opposition politicians on side, whichever party you're on. I think this is a mistake that Theresa May made in Brexit, where if she had said to the Labour Party, right, we want to involve you in this, I think it would have been a lot easier to have got things through. And David Davis, who is seen as quite a competent politician, but he's a good friend of mine. I can say this now. He went out of his way to involve Keir Starmer, who was then Shadow Brexit Secretary, and he made sure that Keir Starmer was made a Privy Councillor, so he could tell him things on so-called Privy Council terms, just to make sure that there weren't any total misunderstandings. Now, that didn't stop Keir Starmer criticising the government's approach or anything, but he probably had a better understanding of what they were trying to achieve. So, I mean, you can't have a permanent coalition government. That would be ridiculous, and I think the public would be not served very well by that. But there are times that parties can work together and should work together. But people always say, "Oh, take the politics out of the NHS." I mean, what a great soundbite, a great motherhood and apple pie expression in many ways. But the NHS takes up about a sixth of public expenditure. Are we really saying that there should be no political involvement in accounting for how that money is spent on behalf of the taxpayer? I don't think so.
Got one statement here, an uncomfortable statement from somebody who says they're the only person in their office who openly voted leave. Literally had co-workers tell him that he voted to kill their kids by denying them epilepsy medication. That's extraordinary and outrageous. What's your response to that?
Well, I'm afraid that was all too typical, and I would like anyone to provide me any evidence that epilepsy medication has been withheld because of Brexit. It absolutely. I mean, look, I'm a diabetic. 70% of the insulin that is used in this country comes from Denmark, and I kept being told, "Oh, well, you're going to die because you won't have any insulin after Brexit." Well, even though the insulin companies and the NHS have said, no, we have 6 months supply anyway. In a worst case scenario, we will be fine. And again, no such problems at all. My sisters voted Remain and told me that I'd ruined my niece's life. Yeah. I'm thinking, I mean, get a grip. It's not as if we're being banned from traveling in Europe. It's not as if we're being banned from working in Europe, or indeed the other way around. And I have never denied that when you change a 40-year relationship, inevitably there are going to be aspects of it which are going to be quite bumpy in the initial few weeks and months. And we've certainly seen that, particularly with the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I had a woman phone in who runs a small business, and she said, look, I can trade with America, I can trade with China, I can be sure that all my goods are delivered there with comparatively little red tape, little bureaucracy. I'm trying to send things to France. It's all being returned to me. Well, if we have a free trade deal, how is that happening? So that there are always going to be this sort of teething problem. And you get the feeling that, shall we say, some rules are being enforced, not just to the letter of the law, but over the letter of the law. But these things will, over time, I have to believe, be solved. But look, the Brexit debate will go on and on. You're never going to get rid of it. But I think we've all got to try and accept, whichever side we were on, if you are somebody who was an arch Remainer, we have actually left. So, I mean, that side of the argument is over. So surely we've all now got to come together and try and make a success of whatever lies ahead. And if you're a Brexiteer, don't sort of rub people's noses in it that they lost and you won, ha, ha, ha. Well, that's not the way to conduct a public debate at all.
Brilliant. Now, I'm in the position here of fielding questions from the audience. Normally it would be hands, and what I've got at the side of me is a Q&A box. So imagine everybody out there that I have to pick some questions for Iain to answer, and I hope that it feels like a fair pick. Question from Declan Williams. Do you think our voting system encourages a polarization of opinions? Would PR make us more tolerant of other views?
I've never been a great fan of PR. I would probably be open to it in local government, because I think there are too many councils in this country that are one-party states, and one-party states lead to fraud and corruption. Where I live in Tunbridge Wells is a good example of that. It's a terribly inefficient council because it's been in the control of one political party, guess which, for forever basically. And there are similar areas in the north of England under the control of the Labour Party, exactly the same kind of thing. So I might be open to it for local government, but I think for Westminster, nobody's ever really, I don't think, come up with a system that retains the same constituency link that we have at the moment. And that is incredibly important in our democracy, I think. I, I mean, I don't think the British public are wanting a change. We saw in the AV referendum in whenever it was, 2011, 2012, that 70 to 30, I mean, an emphatic majority were against it. I think it'd be quite difficult to persuade the British people that there needed to be a change, because we have had a coalition government, we've had a minority government in recent years, but generally you get a reasonably decisive result. And nobody has ever invented a perfect electoral system. And I don't pretend that ours is necessarily the most perfect, but I don't think it's broke enough to really fix it in a radical way.
Brilliant. Now, I think we're going to finish with the next question, but I just need to pass on to you that one of our audience members loves your shirt. Which is terrific. I love your shirt too. But somebody said, this is about the writing of the book, and I think this might be a good question to end on. Were there any surprising challenges faced writing your book? Was it just the keeping going, or was it more than that?
Well, I think because I knew I had to write 70,000 words, so I had 20 chapters, so I knew it was sort of 3,500 words a chapter. And I do write fast, but I was always conscious of the approaching deadline, and I do tend to put things off a bit. That was my only worry, that I wouldn't deliver. I delivered it a week early in the end, and I used to be a publisher, so I always liked authors that delivered a little bit early, and I was always very frustrated. The worst thing for a publisher is when the author rings you up on deadline day and says, "I'm really sorry, I'm going to be another 3 months." Because by that time you sold the books into the bookshops, they're expecting it on a particular date, and they don't like it if you keep changing the publication date. And you say to authors, well, this will cost you sales, but I mean, hey, we're all humans, aren't we? People, and a lot of people are very busy. Most people have full-time jobs while they're writing a book. It's very few authors nowadays who can afford to just live off writing books. If you're Robert Harris and write a successful novel every couple of years, you can do that. But there are very few politically or media-related books where you're going to get a sort of £100,000 advance to write the book. I'm afraid it doesn't happen.
Brilliant. Now, I'm going to finish on a quote from the book, which I think I'm probably going to have embroidered and put on the wall. Never post pictures of your food. No one is interested, not even your mother. And this chimed in so much with my rage when I see pictures of food on Facebook or Insta or any of those things. No one is interested, not even your mother. Any comments on that?
Well, that was at the end of the book. I got when I finished the book, I thought, you know what? I think I've diagnosed all the problems. I'm not sure I've provided enough solutions. So I decided to write 50 ways we can improve public discourse, and that was one of them. I should just say that I mean, I very rarely ever post pictures of food on Instagram. I've only recently got into Instagram a bit more, but I need more followers. So do follow me on Instagram, but don't follow my Instagram title is Iain Dale. There's somebody trying to impersonate me on Instagram at the moment called Iain Dale 4. So if you ever get contacted by Iain Dale 4, report it and block it.
Okay, brilliant. Now, I think we're pretty much at the end of what has been a completely fabulous conversation, Iain. It felt like having you in the room. You were wonderfully informative, and you answered the questions beautifully. So I know that I'm speaking on behalf of the audience here. Thank you so much for a brilliant hour of your time, but also for writing such a warm and completely timely book. So thank you, Ian. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you, James, for doing this evening. I always much prefer talking to someone rather than giving a sort of half-hour kind of lecture, because particularly when you're doing it on Zoom, you kind of think, at least if you've got people in front of you, you can tell if you've lost the audience, but you can't tell that on Zoom, can you?
Thank you.